I don't really know how to start shows.
Come on now, don't start liking me now.
So yeah, I'm funny compared to, well, you'll see later. I stand for mayhem!
I know a lot of fucking idiots that think a lot of shit is mean-spirited just because it goes against what they believe. But the relief of comedy is it takes things that aren't funny and it allows us to laugh about them for an hour.
We got a purple suit to buy and a gigantic coffin.
Why are you laughing?
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Why You Laughing, a history of comedy podcast. And today, I'm pleased to introduce to you the incomparable Steve Martin, one of the all-time greats, honestly. And he's a strange guy, and we'll play a couple clips that actually describe what his legacy is pretty well. But I think we'll also reference his book a lot, which is one of the best comedy books, if not the best ever written, Born Standing Up. And in that book, he refers to his act as basically a parody of an entertainer, which I think is actually the right way to describe what he did, because a lot of people misinterpret what Steve Martin is because of some of the people that imitated him years later. And I always think of the line in The Office when Dunder Mifflin, the Scranton branch, is getting shut down. And Michael Scott says to, I think, Pam, did I ever tell you about the day Steve Martin died? She says, Steve Martin's still alive, Michael. And he goes, I always thought the day Steve Martin died would be the worst day of my life, but I was wrong. It's this. But people like, Michael Scott in real life would like Steve Martin, but not really get what he was doing. And then kind of imitate that without understanding it. So, over the years, people started to misinterpret Steve Martin as kind of a hack. And I think being involved in a lot of the kids' movies that he did and things like that probably didn't help. Right. But he's the second straight guy we've done, him and Bill Hicks, that I didn't know a ton about their careers before doing the episode. And then afterwards, I walked away liking them a lot more and being a lot more interested in them. So we will get into that today. But first, I do want to remind you guys, blindmike.net is where you find everything. If you're a Why You Laughing fan, if you want to check out the Blind Mike Project, hopefully the WATS links will be up there soon. You can find all the free links up there, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and whatnot. And you can also check out the Patreon if you want bonus episodes, a couple of at least 2 bonus episodes every month, plus mini episodes that we'll be doing for Why You Laughing. You can also get these episodes a week early on the Patreon. So get subscribed and go there if you'd be so kind.
Be kind.
Was there one other thing I wanted to mention? I don't know. I can't remember. But yeah, his book Born Standing Up is like I said, considered one of the best comedy books of all time. And it's an interesting insight because you learn kind of how smart and insightful Steve Martin is for comedy. But the takeaway that I took from it was for a guy to be that as famous as Steve Martin got to be and write a book that is so self-aware. There's a lot of self-awareness in that book, I feel like. So that was my big takeaway, to reach kind of the heights that he did, but still be in touch with how he came up and the struggles of a comedian and relating to kind of his early days. And he's also a guy, we talked about Robin Williams. He's in the discussion, I would say, honestly, top 2 or 3. I mean, if you want to extend it to top 5, but he's definitely up there of the most successful comedians of all time. But he quit comedy over 40 years ago. He quit stand-up, I should say, over 40 years ago. So a lot of people forget that. So we will get into it. He was born in Texas, quickly moved to California, and then started working at Disneyland at a young age. And this is something that we found, remember we talked about Rodney Dangerfield being a singing waiter.
Yeah.
And Carson was a magician. We talked about all these older guys had to find multiple things because being a stand-up comic wasn't quite a career yet in the 50s and 60s. So he talks a little bit about that. I think he's on Stern here in our first clip.
This first one's about him getting on stage.
Yeah, let's hear that.
So you're working at Disney, and this is kind of Steve Martin legend. You're working at Disney World and Disneyland,
yeah.
And you got exposed to entertainers and things. And you think about it, a guy with your background, a kid, suddenly says, "I've got the bug. I want to be an entertainer." But there's no one in your family to emulate.
Well, I didn't know what it meant to be an entertainer. I knew early that I loved comedy. I mean, I've never phrased it like I'm phrasing now. I just loved comedy.
You never said, "I want to be a comedian."
No, I didn't even know what that was.
Right.
Wanting to be a comedian came later when I figured out I just wanted to be on stage, and that was a way to be on stage.
Right.
Was to be. I didn't sing or dance or act or do anything. That's all I had was a magic act.
Right.
And I would go see this comedian named Wally Bogue at the Golden Horseshoe Review. It was a free show, and it was fantastic.
And what did Wally do?
He did balloon animals.
There you go.
And he was just funny. It was like corny jokes, and I saw his show hundreds of times, and he was always fresh. He did the same show,
like that old show
40
business
times a
thing.
week.
If you do the same show, you never know who's in the audience. Just go out and give them your best show. And the guy was brilliant.
He was so funny, so genuinely funny.
And did you get to know the guy at all?
I did just a little bit, but my fantasy was I'm sitting there in the audience watching him. I would be 12 or 13 or 14. And my fantasy was that he would get sick. And
they would call you.
Somebody would say, "Does anybody know this show?" in the audience.
And you knew it.
I would be ready to go.
And so it's interesting. That's funny, by the way, but it's just interesting that, back then it was kind of, you just wanted to get on stage and you would do whatever you could. And that's why Steve Martin learned the banjo, and he was a juggler. Like he had all these literally balls in the air, just trying to become a performer, because you don't even really know, like, can I be a stand-up comedian and make money? Like, that didn't really happen at that time. And, interestingly enough, Steve Martin is a guy who paved the way. Like now, the top 30 acts in America are touring in arenas around the country. Probably even more than that if you really started counting. But being like an arena act is still obviously a crazy achievement, but it's not a rare thing in America now, because stand-up is a much more respected art form and has more than just like a cult following. But when Steve Martin was doing it, that was literally unheard of. He's the first guy that ever got to that level. So, he just wanted to be a performer. And another thing that's interesting about that, we'll get into his father a little later, because he was a interesting guy. But his father wanted to be an entertainer. He wanted to be an actor or a performer in some way. And in his book, Steve wrote, it's very funny. And this was another thing I had when I was listening to his book. Seinfeld is always attributed as the guy, I'm sure we've mentioned it on here a bunch, where, everyone always says comedians have some sort of demon or some sort of vice, like either they're an alcoholic or a drug addict, or, some sort of darkness that kind of fuels their humor. And Seinfeld is always pointed to as the one example of like, I don't really know what his thing is, his vice or his darkness. And even with Seinfeld, I would say maybe like he's kind of a prick. So maybe it's as simple as that. But then I was thinking, like, Steve Martin's a guy that I can't think of any controversies or anything with him. Like, I think the worst tabloids written about him were he got divorced in the 90s,
That, or in recent memory, just handcuffing your career to Martin Short.
What do you mean?
I don't know. Every time they're just inseparable now. And I'm just like, come on, just go back to being yourself, I think.
No, I don't know. I like Martin Short.
I do too. But I didn't think.
My point is, let's not derail me here. My point is that Steve Martin, I can't really think of any like controversies or anything with him. And in his book, he writes about how his father, and this is very common back in the day, but like him and his sister and his mother never knew what kind of mood his dad was going to come home in. And they told this one story about Steve. His father asked him something, and Steve kind of mumbled the answer, and his father said, "What?" And then he pulls out his belt and just starts beating the shit out of him. And he said, it's the only time he abused me. But after that, my relationship with my father was very formal. And he goes to this whole thing. And he goes, anyways, I tell all of you that to inform you that my credentials to be a comedian are there. So it was almost like he wanted to prove himself. Like, I do have darkness in me.
It's there.
Yeah.
That's very funny.
But yeah, his father's definitely an interesting guy, and their relationship is kind of a touching part of the book at the end, which we'll get into more. But let's keep going for now.
This is his first time on the Tonight Show.
Yeah. So he worked for, he continued with the magic and kind of, crafted that into a comedic act. And in fact, his first time on television was the Smothers Brothers. He wrote for the Smothers Brothers, which, by the way, we're gonna have to do a Smothers Brothers episode, because the more we keep doing these episodes, a lot of people came up via the Smothers Brothers. And even Steve Martin talked about his writing partner on this show was Bob Einstein, who we talked about a couple weeks ago, Marty Funkhauser. And Rob Reiner, I think, also worked on that show at the time. But his first TV appearance was a magic act, and that was also his first Tonight Show appearance too. And obviously it was comedic, but it was almost like he used it as a crutch to be like, hey, I'm doing magic. And then, kind of out of the side of your eye, you're like, oh, this guy's funny too, But this is his first set on Carson, which I think depicts a little more of what I was talking about when I said a parody of an entertainer.
Seeing all these people, there must be 500 people in here and there's millions of people watching at home. I really began to realize we have a population problem. So I gave it some thought, and I came up with a fantastic solution to the population explosion. It's so simple. Death penalty for parking violations. I have a lot of good ideas, actually. Take mugging. That's a problem, right? Getting robbed on the streets. Well, I realized that muggers don't like to rob you if they think you're crazy. So let's say you have $10 and you want to walk down the street with it. First, you wet your pants. Then you wear a tie and set it on fire. But if you don't want to get that involved, a much simpler thing, the moment you are aware you are being robbed, throw up on your money.
So we always talk about influences on this show, and it's amazing when you say like people sound like this guy and kind of adopt their voice. If I just sent you the audio of that and told you it was David Letterman, would you not believe me?
Right.
Like, that sounds a lot like creepily like Letterman.
Yeah.
So yeah, obviously, Letterman took a lot from, like, Steve Martin would walk out, like in that set, he walks out and says, I'm Steve Martin and I'll be out here in a minute. And it's like little weird shit like that, where he was at the forefront and it was him. Andy Kaufman was coming up at that time. He gives a lot of credit to like Steve Allen and Jack Benny and guys like that. So it has been around before, but what Steve says is like, and it's interesting, and I think you can kind of make comparisons to where we are now in comedy a little bit. But at that time when he was coming up, and it's also not long after, both Kennedys and Martin Luther King were assassinated. But at the time, like, he's doing the Tonight Show there, the country's at war with Vietnam, the Manson shit is going on. And then like later in the decade, you have Watergate, all these like big politically fueled stories that people were, taking on to the stage. And even if you took someone as like goofy as fucking Rich Little, he would be doing Nixon material, So like everyone was political at that time. And so Steve Martin said, I'm going to do the exact opposite and be completely silly. And that's where you get, the arrow through the head and all that stuff. And then we'll play later. Seinfeld has a very good description of it, but it's like Steve Martin's act was very easy to look at and think, oh, he's an idiot, because you don't realize he understands fully what he's doing. And then the people that imitated him over and over the years, like the one influence I thought of too, that gives a good example of what I'm talking about was, do you remember the song parody man, Todd Pettingale, that we talked about?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's Todd Pettingale is probably a guy that fits the Michael Scott description that I was giving, where I would bet you he was a huge Steve Martin fan. But he doesn't have the intelligence or the nuance to implement the skills that Steve Martin had. He just saw, oh, let me do song parodies or something like that, you know? So it took someone like a Letterman, who was also, you know, a great comedic mind, to say, like, I kind of like what these guys like Andy Kaufman and Steve Martin are doing. I'm going to put my own twist on that. But if you listen to Steve talk about, like, he took like philosophy courses in college, and he took a lot from that, it seemed like, because the way he talks about approaching comedy in such a different form, you really do get the sense that he's a genuine genius, honestly. Like, he is a comedic genius. And and I was fascinated by this part just because I had seen the movie a couple months ago for the first time. Did you ever see the movie Trumbo starring Bryan Cranston?
No, I have not.
Very good. No one really saw it, but it was about Dalton Trumbo, who was a blacklisted writer in the 50s and 60s. And he would write screenplays under a bunch of different aliases, and the most famous one probably being Spartacus. And Steve Martin dated his daughter, and he would go over to the house and they would have these like intellectual discussions. And Dalton Trumbo would be ripping Hollywood, and he would have these paintings insulting the people that have run him out of the business and things like that. And so that's kind of where Steve Martin learned to have more, I guess, insightful or intelligent discussions. At least that's how he describes it.
We got him talking about headlining.
Yeah, so this was interesting because, like I said, he wrote for the Smothers Brothers, Sonny and Cher, and he started doing like the Tonight Show and things. But he was going on the road and opening. He opened for bands and singers as well as other comedians. And this is him talking about kind of taking that next step up.
There's a very brave decision in there, leaving the world of television where you're successful, because certainly writing for Sonny and Cher, writing for Smothers Brothers, walking away from it and saying, now I'm going to go be a performer. That's a big, and then your income gets completely shot.
Yeah,
right?
wiped out. But you know what I had? Residuals. I had residuals from writing, which were diminishing,
right?
Because it always diminishes. And that kept me going for a while. And I remember one time I called David Brenner, who was very successful.
Amazing.
And I said, David, I get paid $300 for a show, and it cost me $250 to get there. He says, what do you do? This was the best advice I ever got that changed my career.
Right.
He said, what I do is I take the door and let the club take the bar.
Right.
And I have a friend stand there with a clicker as if people come in. And I had decided at that time to be an opening act no longer. I was an opening act. I said, people do not attend or perceive the opening act. They're there for the headliner. So I decided only to headline. So I went to a little club called Bubba's, I think it was called, in Coconut Grove. Yeah. And this was the first time I was going to only headline. And
ballsy move, right? Because who the hell knew you? No one.
So my income just really, really dropped. But that changed my life, because when I started headlining, people started paying attention a little bit.
Where do you think you get the guts to do that? Honestly, I mean, because I don't
think it takes guts. It's inevitable. I don't think it's guts.
You just had to do it.
You had to do it. Yeah.
And when
I think he's wrong about that. I do think it is gutsy, especially because another thing I found interesting that he wrote about was the Tonight Show. We've talked a bunch about how, you could go on the Tonight Show and it would make your career. And for some guys, I do think that was true. And the example I always go back to was Freddie Prinze. But luckily for Freddie Prinze, someone at NBC saw him and said, "Oh, I want to pair this guy with someone else. He can be the young Hispanic kid, to the old white curmudgeon, whatever Chico and the Man was." I never watched it, but I assume that's the gist of it. So, in instances like that, it does really help your career if the right person gives you an opportunity. But the way Steve Martin described it was totally different, where he said that, you go on once and nothing happens. You go on 6 times and someone will come up to you and say, "Hey, didn't I see you at a party? Did I meet you somewhere?" You go on 10 or 12 times and they're like, "Hey, where do I know you? You were on something, right?" And so it wasn't this instant overnight success that the Tonight Show gave him. And same with, writing for the Smothers brothers. He won an Emmy, but no one knew who the hell he was. And so Steve wanted to be a performer and wanted to be out there. And he looked at it and said, the one way I do that is just by doing it. Now, I will say the luxury that Steve has that other people don't now is like, if let's say you're at a gig here in Boston and, you're kind of an up and coming comedian and you don't sell out, the club owner just says, "Well, I'm not going to book anymore. Fuck you." Whereas back in the day, it was the club owner's obligation to sell tickets.
Right.
So it was more on them to get people into the building, where that for some reason stopped existing.
Probably because of the amount of comics.
That's true. Yeah. And the amount of locations, I would think too. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. What's next?
Comedy philosophy.
Oh, yeah. So this is a little what I was talking about before, and I think he has a very interesting thing. I shit on Seinfeld for about 45 minutes for his comedy philosophy because I thought it was very pretentious, where Steve Martin probably had even more success than Seinfeld. And I find his philosophy to be much more relatable and grounded, I think.
More successful in comedy. I just want
to... hard to say. I don't know. I love Seinfeld so much more than I love anything Steve Martin did. But Steve Martin probably made a shit ton more money, put it that way. I don't know that.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I think I might be wrong. I'm definitely wrong about that. Seinfeld's almost a billionaire.
Yeah, he's just shy. I think 50 million. He'll get there soon.
Yeah. So, and Seinfeld chose to stay. And that's the other thing is Seinfeld could do arenas if he wanted to.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But anyways, let's hear Stevie's philosophy.
And there's some point where you're using sort of other people's material, comedians.
That was early on.
Right. And then you kind of come to the conclusion, I got to do my own thing, but I don't want punchline jokes. I don't understand that. What do you mean you didn't want punchline jokes?
I'll explain it.
Okay.
I'm in college and I'm studying philosophy and I'm examining everything. That's the premise of studying philosophy in college, is to examine everything that's going on.
Yeah.
And I started to really examine comedy. And I noticed there's 2 kinds of laughter. One is when you're watching a comedian and he says a joke and then you laugh at it because you heard the punchline. And sometimes it's really funny and you're laughing, and other times it's okay, but you still laugh because you're laughing on the rhythm.
Right.
And I thought, but there's another kind of laughter too. When you're home with your friends and you're laughing so hard and you're crying, you can't stop laughing. And when you think about it, you don't know why you're laughing.
Right.
You're just laughing. And I thought, what if I could go for that? Go for trying to actually be funny, where people are really laughing. And you say, what are you laughing at? They go, I don't know.
I think that, again, I don't know if you want to use the word ballsy or whatever, but that is a very smart approach to it. And I think the best example of what he's talking about with the timed laughter is obviously sitcoms. Because if you go to the Blind Mike Project Patreon, blindmike.net, check it out. A while back, we watched an episode of the sitcom Two Broke Girls and just played a game. We wanted to see when we could find a sentence of actual dialogue that wasn't set up punchline, set up punchline, set up punchline.
Like actual human words.
Yes, the way humans would talk, where it's not, I'm setting you up for a joke and you're going to slam me. But the way they did it was like tricking the audience into thinking, my God, this is a laugh a minute. This is hysterical. And, there's a million compilations of every sitcom with the laugh track removed, where it's like, they're duping me here into thinking something hilarious is happening. And Steve Martin noticed that even with live crowds. And it's interesting because, like, that's true of even guys I really like, where I'll see them, in a theater or in a comedy club, and then, watch them on Netflix, a different set, and be like, I found this shit so much more funny when you were in the environment.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and that's just, it's just, part of the energy of being there versus sitting on your couch alone. But Steve Martin looked at it and said, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm not going to do any of that. And he would start doing really weird shit. Like when he was in comedy clubs, he would essentially say, like, all right, guys, follow me. And he would walk out of the club and out onto the street. And, a couple hundred people would follow him, and he would do whatever show. Like, I think one story he told was he'd go back to his hotel room and he had everyone jump in the pool. And that's again, very Letterman. Like, as I was listening to his book, I could feel Letterman doing that type of shit back in the 80s. And that's when he said, like, I found something here. Like, I'm doing something different and weird because the audience was responding to it. So taking those chances that's what separates him from the guys who imitated him later, where Steve Martin was coming up with things and taking these chances. Whereas, people in years after that were essentially just imitating him.
Thanks for doing all the work, bud.
Yeah, he paved the way to make it a lot easier for a lot of hacks later on.
So you're telling me that does work? Interesting. Next is him talking about Elvis.
Yeah, I just threw this in because I thought it was an interesting story, and it does give you a little bit of the scope of how famous Steve Martin was. And by the way, we have it's not just Stern, don't worry.
He came back, first, he was a gigantic person. And the first, I was just standing in my dressing room. I was opening for Anne Margaret, actually. And Priscilla came around the corner, who is, or especially was, strikingly beautiful. And, I was like, saw her like this. She was all dressed in white. And then Elvis, who was gigantic, came over. I think he was 6'4" or something, and had a huge gold belt buckle on. He was all dressed in black. And he started to go in Anne Margaret's dressing room, and then he turned and he caught my eye, and he came in and he said, "Son, you have an oblique sense of humor." Just like that. We ended up, my manager was, a real fan, knew the whole history of Elvis, so we started talking to him. We talked to him for a long time, maybe 25 minutes, and one of his, he had a lot of aides around him, and one of his men came over and said, "Elvis, we have to go now." And Elvis went, "It's okay." And then we talked for another 10 minutes.
He said, I heard a different interview where he said that guy's job was essentially to pretend Elvis had somewhere to go. So like when they were in public, like if you saw Elvis in a conversation, he would come up and be like, "Hey, we got to get out of here." And Elvis would either go, "Sorry, man, I got to go," or "Don't worry about it. I'm interested in this conversation."
It's kind of amazing because you always hear like these Elvis stories, like he couldn't be bothered, or he would be somewhere for 4 seconds and then he's off already. The fact that they had him for like 40 minutes is kind of crazy.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, yeah, that speaks to how interesting Steve Martin is, but also maybe he wasn't zooted up that day. Who knows?
That's a great point.
But yeah, it's the speed with which Steve Martin rose is pretty crazy. And we've talked about guys who have probably skyrocketed quicker than Steve Martin, but like I said, to get to the level that he did without any help from, like, of course, he started to get help from SNL, but they said that SNL's viewership jumped by 1 million people when he would host. So it's like, chicken or the egg, who's helping who there? Mm. And, his first movie, The Jerk, came out while he was still doing stand-up, technically, but he was already playing arenas that. So like Steve Martin really and truly got to that level, by just carving out this weird niche for himself. And then that niche kind of grew and grew to people who wanted to see bizarre acts like that.
Yeah, and The Jerk is a bunch of people's. Like, that would be in a bunch of top fives all time.
You know, oddly enough, it was just trending the other, as if they knew we were going to do this episode. Just like 3 days ago, for some reason, The Jerk was trending. And I clicked on it because I knew we were doing this episode. And I think it was as simple as someone tweeted out, like, what do you know Steve Martin from? And most people said The Jerk.
Oh, no kidding.
Now, like, our generation, sadly, probably knows him for like Cheaper by the Dozen.
That's probably the first time I saw him.
But me too, and I saw that movie being the product of a dad who had to find something to do with his children when he had them on the weekends. I saw that movie in theaters. So
yeah, parents watch that when they have like a couple kids just to feel better about themselves.
So, but you know what? It's a similarity that Steve Martin, Eddie Murphy, and Robin Williams all have, and I think there's a reason for it. I think it's a culmination of a few things. And you know what? You could throw Sandler in there, Jim Carrey, I think, as well.
Yep. All
these guys that come from stand-up but get super, super huge. I think they hit a point where, like, a lot of money is thrown at you to do kids' movies. Like, those make a shit ton of money. So they figure, hey, parents are going to want to bring their kids to a movie that Steve Martin is in. So that's the money is certainly one aspect of it, but like these guys also get to a certain age where like Steve Martin would talk about the amount of work that went into stand-up, and he's like, at some point, you know, someone made him realize that like, hey, if you start doing movies, you're going to them rather than having to go to each of their towns to entertain them.
Yeah, he actually has a great quote about that in one of the clips. I forget which one, but. That's him saying that though is when I went, oh, so I don't think you actually loved comedy.
Well, that's the interesting thing about Steve Martin. I meant to say that at the beginning, actually, when we were introducing him, because I genuinely think he wrote one of the best books about stand-up. If any of you young whippersnappers out there, which I'm sure we have a lot of based on the way I talk, but any of you kids that want to get into comedy, I would definitely say read that book, because I think it gives you a good perspective in like how comedians start and the mindset that they should have. Yet, I don't think he's a guy that wanted to be a stand-up.
No.
And I think that's true of a lot of guys who, you know, got famous in stand-up in the, you know, you had Lenny Bruce who just wanted his opinion out there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like he truly was like, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? An advocate of free speech and what he believed in, and was willing to, you know, get arrested for it. But that was all underground niche shit. Lenny Bruce was never going to be playing arenas. He'd never be allowed in them.
Right.
Same with George Carlin. George Carlin got arrested for shit he was saying on stage early on. Steve Martin was a guy who wanted to entertain, and he wanted to be light and silly. I don't know that he wanted to be a stand-up. Now you have a group of guys who are both very successful, but also came up wanting to be stand-ups. I don't know if that's the case for Rob. Like we talked about Robin Williams, he went to Juilliard. He wanted to be a stand-up. He wanted to be an actor. You know, so I think that's the case with a lot of these guys back in the 70s.
The thing with Robin Williams, though, is after he became famous actor, he still did stand-up.
He did. And, you know, I mean, you do have Steve Martin now going back on stage with Martin Short, and it's a thing maybe he's more comfortable with than doing a solo act. But obviously he does have that bug a little bit, or he wouldn't have done that. But yeah, you're right in the sense that I don't think he like loved stand-up the way you hear a guy like to compare him to Seinfeld again.
Yeah.
Seinfeld has $1 billion and will still come and play, you know, the Wang Theater in Boston.
Same with Chappelle and take him or leave him, like however you feel about Joe Rogan.
Chappelle for sure. I mean, Chappelle is Lenny Bruce, but also just has a lot of money, you know?
Yeah, I know, but I'm saying
he would be doing it in basements if he had to.
Right, but like that's what I'm saying. Like he's one of those guys that no matter how much money is in his bank account, he's still going to do it. Steve Martin jumped ship as soon as he could. Next, we have Seinfeld talking about him. Yeah,
so like I said, Seinfeld's talking about his book here, and I think gives a good summary of why Steve Martin is successful.
But all good comedy, I think, is intellectual. You know, even somebody like Steve Martin, who's written this fantastic, I think the best book ever written about comedy that's coming out, I think, in a couple months, called The Comic's Life.
Yeah.
And
which is his memoir, is it?
It's his memoir of his life as a comedian.
Pause one second. Just so there's no confusion, that ended up being like the subtitle. It's called Born Standing Up, A Comic's Life. Just so you know, there's not two different books.
Yeah, he got an advance copy he's talking about.
Yeah.
There's a guy.
He's inside that Seinfeld.
He knows a couple people.
Is it? It's his memoir of his life as a comedian. Now, there's a guy, I think a lot of people would think, well, he was just silly. You know, he was silly. No, he was incredibly intellectual. And when you put intellectualism with an arrow through the head, that makes you laugh. Just an arrow through the head does not make you laugh.
And that's what I'm talking about, where he's an intellectual guy, and he's not just putting an arrow on his head and being like, isn't this funny? He has a reason for doing it. Whereas, you know, guys after that would use a rubber chicken, didn't know what the fuck they were doing. They're just like, oh, Steve Martin did shit like this.
Right.
You know, another guy too that I think is kind of a mix of those two people that we've talked about before is Bob Saget, where like Bob Saget was a musical act. And I think maybe he used that as a crutch early on. You know, as almost a defense mechanism, like kind of hiding behind the guitar a little bit, but also like, I think he was finding his voice, you know what I mean? And then I think eventually Bob Saget did become a funny comedian. And the one I always think of is Bo Burnham. Well, Bo Burnham's obviously one of my favorite comedians that there is. I always say it's not stand-up, it's a different thing that he does, but he's still kind of in that category. And one interview that he did that always stood out to me is Bo Burnham he was promoting the movie that he made, 8th Grade, about like a 7th grade girl, or 8th grade girl, obviously. I'm an idiot. And the movie's called 8th Grade. It's about a 7th grader. But he was out promoting that, and he did an interview with The Bonfire on Sirius XM, and Big J. Okerson was there. He's the host of the program, and he's an absolutely filthy comedian, obviously. And at the end of the interview, Bo Burnham says, he goes, Jay, by the way, I wanted to thank you again. Like, I know I've said this to you before, but it's always meant a lot to me. When I was coming up, you, out of all people, you would go out of your way to be nice to me. You'd come up and talk to me, and you were very supportive. And like, I've always remembered that, and I just wanted to thank you for that again. And I thought that was such an interesting thing for two reasons. A, it's hilarious that Kevin Hart and Bo Burnham thank Jay for their success while he's on the radio with Dan Soder, two of the biggest acts in America. But the reason it stood out to me is because a lot of people would look at Bo Burnham and write him off as just some hack that uses a keyboard on stage.
Yeah.
Particularly because he got successful when he was so young. You know, he's 17 years old. I remember he was like 17, 18 years old playing the Mullen Center at UMass in front of a couple thousand people.
I remember when he was just big on YouTube.
Yeah. And had millions of views. So people get resentful of that, and they're like, oh, he's a musical hack that has a guitar and a piano. Meanwhile, I think he's like one of the great geniuses of this generation in comedy. So it would have been easy to write Steve Martin off as that as well back in the 70s if you didn't realize what he was doing, which is why I think a lot of people look at Steve Martin now. And like I said, things like Cheaper by the Dozen don't necessarily help, but it makes it easier to look at Steve Martin and be like, oh, he's wearing an arrow through his head, rather than understanding why he was doing all that.
We have him talking about SNL.
Yeah, so like I said, that was, he's a weird guy. Him and Alec Baldwin would be two guys that were essentially cast members to the point where they have characters. like if you're talking about some of the great characters that SNL made up, you would think of Steve Martin and Alec Baldwin characters.
Right.
So that's how often they were on that fucking show. But let's hear him talk about it a little.
You have the record for the number of guest hosting of Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a big prize for it or
it's
anything.
a big deal, isn't it? I mean,
yeah. But I've been there since the beginning. People haven't.
Yeah. How did that happen?
I was just starting to break as Saturday Night Live was starting to break, and so I think George Carlin hosted the first show. I wasn't on until the second year, really.
Yeah.
And
Lorne was a friend or not?
Nope, didn't know him.
Didn't know it.
No, he became a very close friend. Yeah. And in fact, I'll mention his name, Lorne Michaels. That's how close we are.
Yes.
And it was strictly an agent, but I had enough stuff going on that I was, the young comedian who could host the show.
And it, obviously in hindsight, it is a perfect fit, but he also talked about how he looked at it. He saw what Saturday Night Live was doing, like in the first season with Chevy Chase there, and was thinking like, oh shit, I'm not as original as I thought I was, because he saw people doing, similar things to him. And in reality, what was happening was a genre was being created that came to be known as alt comedy, essentially. And what's sad is now we think of alt comedy as just being a hipster, whiny liberal, I guess. For whatever reason, it's come to mean that. But what alt comedy was for a long time was people like Steve Martin, who weren't necessarily going on stage and doing set up punchline. They were doing different weird things. I think David Letterman would have been considered alt comedy.
Yeah, it used to be like Carrot Top or something. Just some weird little thing. Like you said,
well, you know who would be an alt comedian, and I guess is probably considered that still. But the two guys I thought of that are definitely influenced by Steve Martin today would be guys like Rory Scovel. You know who that is?
Yep.
And Todd Glass were the two that I thought of.
Oh, that's a good one.
Who are very funny. And the specific reason I thought of Todd Glass was, did you ever watch his Netflix special?
Which one was that? I don't forget what it's called.
So him and Rory Scovel are friends, obviously. And Rory Scovel got a Netflix special first. And then Todd Glass got one. And in the bit he mentions, obviously this was shot in a way where it was edited after, I'm assuming he told the crowd to do this. Otherwise it was a brilliant stroke of luck. But he's telling the story and he says, my friend Rory Scovel. And the crowd starts chanting, fuck Rory Scovel, fuck Rory Scovel, fuck Rory Scovel. And the way it's shot is so bright because you see Todd looking so innocent and going, guys, no, that's my friend. Stop it, please. And it's so funny and weird and out of nowhere. And it's shit like that is modern day. That's what Steve Martin would be doing if he was coming up now. You know what I mean? With the ability to edit and do that sort of shit.
We just need Steve Martin and Eddie Murphy to go on a tour together.
I mean, that's the great debate is would they still have it? I think Steve Martin on some level would, because he's always done. Even though he's quit stand up, he's still been Steve Martin. He's hosted award shows and all that. He had a great line. It was the Kennedy Center Honors. It was honoring Lorne Michaels, and they had Steve Martin host it. And he goes, this is a great thrill for me because when I was a young boy, I used to always dress up and play honoring Lorne Michaels at the Kennedy Center. so he's still been Steve Martin throughout his career, and SNL is another example where it's he's still doing that Steve Martin type of shit. Eddie Murphy's different because it's would he be able to have that energy that he had on stage? But we've debated that a bunch before. I think it would be hard to just turn that on after so many years of not doing it.
I think he could do it. I think he would do it. We'll have to find out someday.
Yes, we certainly will. What's next?
We got him talk. This is the sad part: quitting stand-up.
Well, yeah, that's why I was kind of waiting, because I knew he would talk a little bit about why he left, and then I wanted to get into if he were to come back. But this is him kind of explaining why he stopped doing live shows.
When did you do your last stand-up?
It would have been 1981.
This is 3 years after the tape we saw.
Yes, and I was working in, I think, somewhere in Atlantic City or somewhere, a different kind of venue, sort of one of those, supper club type situations. And I hadn't taken any bookings. I'd just finished The Jerk, and it had come out and had been a hit. And I really didn't know if I was still a stand-up comedian or not. But the fact that I wasn't taking any bookings was telling me I wasn't.
You weren't enjoying
quitting.
it anymore.
I didn't
become routine.
It became routine, and I guess you don't enjoy it anyway because because
it's hard.
It's hard, and you're thinking about it all the time. You're working. It's an artistic job, and it's like a ballet. I mean, I wonder if I don't know if a ballet dancer does a giant leap and is actually free in their mind, or they're thinking, whew,
Was it satisfying for you to write this book and look back?
Very satisfying. And by the way, just to say, I did enjoy doing it.
Yeah.
There were times it was just magic out there, and
magic like you've never felt before in any other kind of performance.
Well, performing was fun. It was all the other stuff that was, age related. As you get older, you don't want to go to a different town every night.
Yeah.
And when I made my first film, I thought, I stay home and the movie goes to their town.
Am I crazy, or is Charlie Rose a terrible interviewer?
Terrible. He doesn't.
What are you answering for him?
Stern does the same thing all the time in an interview. Stern will do the same thing. He'll ask a question, they'll start speaking, and then he'll try to finish.
So this is probably what you mean.
Yeah, and then they're always like, no.
Well, but anyway, I was glad that Steve Martin kind of explained that a little bit, because when you're hearing the first part of his answer, it goes back to what you were talking about earlier, where it's like, did he hate stand-up?
Yeah.
But there is a point to be made there where it's like, no matter what you're doing, if you're doing a dumb podcast like this, if you're a stand-up, whatever, a job, that you want and that you would like, it still becomes, there are days where you're like, fuck, I have to get back up on stage and do this. Even, it's an hour out of your day, or 2 hours, depending on how many shows you do.
He's also one of the first people that didn't enjoy the stage part. Usually people quit because of the travel, but he even threw in going on stage kind of sucked.
Well, that's what I'm saying is that's where I understand part of what he's saying, but the first half of his answer sounds like he purely hated it. Yeah. And then he does explain by the way, I did like it. There was a lot that I liked, but he, to the conversation we were having earlier, I think there is something to he does not miss it. I don't get the sense that he misses, going up on stage in front of a crowd. Now, what I always wonder about, because another thing Steve talked about in his book was basically he started playing these arenas, and he played Nassau Coliseum, which was 40-something thousand seats. He was talking, 20,000 seat arenas became commonplace for him. And it got to the point where, I mentioned him taking the audience out onto the street. Even when he got into theaters with a couple thousand people, you can't do that shit. And it started to chip away. Okay, all right, I got to, refigure out how I do these things. And then it got to the point where, in arenas that big, if someone yelled out, I can respond to this guy, but half the audience didn't hear him, doesn't even know that someone yelled anything, then it becomes weird. And the other thing he noticed is, earlier we were talking about that automatic laughter, the way that sitcoms have it. And he started to notice, it's similar to we've talked about with Eddie Murphy, where people are just this is Steve Martin, this is going to be hilarious. So now he's getting laughs based on who he is rather than what he's doing. And that he got very frustrated with. Now, the thing I wonder about guys like that, because they always say they can't go out and work out their material. But what if Steve Martin just showed up at the Comedy Store at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday? You know what I mean? I always wonder about that, where it's if you show up at a place like that where there's, 15 people there.
And they'll probably not know who he is. There'll be a lot of young people.
Steve Martin. He's got that. No murders in the building or something like that. Like he spans every generation pretty much. He's stayed relevant even today.
Yeah, that's true.
So it'd be tough to not know who Steve Martin was. But, the thing that like Damon, this is what Damon Wayans would do. We've mentioned this before too, where he would bury himself in the first 5 minutes and then try to work his way out of it. Like he would intentionally bomb so that the charm of like, oh, we're seeing Damon Wayans is gone. You know what I mean? So like, I do wonder if they could do stuff like that. But it sounds like Steve Martin kind of has the mentality of like, well, why would I do that?
It's so wild.
Steve fucking Martin.
Yeah, it's so wild to think that there was a charm of Damon Wayans at one point.
He was huge.
I know.
He's like, at his peak, he was like one of the biggest.
He was gigantic. Major Payne was one of my favorite movies growing up.
Well, there you go. A real feather in Damon Wayans' cap.
Funny movie.
Are we hearing about his father now?
No.
Okay.
This is exposing the act.
Oh, yeah. So this goes a little more into what I was talking about.
Done a performance, this is as good as I'll ever be.
Probably.
When was it? Or do you know?
It would have been somewhere around 1975. It wasn't downhill from there. So, but looking back now, I go, that's when I was really funny. And I think the reason I was really funny is the act was unknown to people. It had not been exposed like it became exposed like by 1978. The act you saw it, everybody's way ahead of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that I think goes to it too, where it's like, with Dice, I think people yelling out the nursery rhymes worked. Because like Steve Martin was the first rock and roll comedian in the way that like that's how he built his audience the same way, like a rock and roll band would in a sense. But Dice was the first guy that really like fit that character. You know what I mean? Like of a rock star. You look at Steve Martin, he doesn't look like a rock star comedian, whereas Andrew Dice Clay does.
Right.
And so for whatever reason, people yelling out, "What's in the bowl, bitch?" It works. With Steve Martin's act, it doesn't, because the timing was so important to what he was doing, and the silences often were even more important.
Yeah,
like
the crowd participation with Dice is part of the allure to his shows.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a frat house type of mentality almost. But with Steve Martin, like part of the concern about his album was there were a lot of visual gags, and it's like, would this work? And it turns out it did, because they both sold over 2 million copies. But that was a legitimate worry at the time. Like, is this going to play on an audio medium? So now when you add people yelling shit out, because don't forget, Steve Martin also had catchphrases, excuse me, and wild and crazy guy, where, those were quoted before. I never knew they were Steve Martin's as a kid, but I knew both quotes. Right. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like I had heard both of those and didn't even realize it was a Steve Martin thing when I was young. So that's how popular those were. So you would have people yelling that shit out, and Steve Martin's the type of act where that completely ruins the joke that he was doing, whatever his setup was, Yep. Whereas Dice would just say, "Shut the fuck up,"
You who?
Yeah. All right.
Now this is the part about his dad.
Yeah, I was oddly excited to talk about this just because it's so bizarre. But like I said, his father wanted to be an entertainer. They had kind of a frosty relationship when Steve was young. And his father would always tell him to get out of the business. And this is one of the more interesting stories about their dynamic.
What happened to the relationship with your father as you're becoming more and more successful?
Well, it was complicated because I began to notice something, that he was not complimentary. This is toward my career, not complimentary at all. And I think it came from that
I'm expecting him to cut him off and be like, "So he thought you were a disappointment?"
Oddly enough, that's what you're doing now. It came full circle.
Yeah.
Actually didn't like what I was doing.
He wrote a review for the Real Estate Journal or something.
Yeah, he gave me a bad review once, which was, and he told me later he was ashamed about it. He had written this bad review of my first appearance on Saturday Night Live, and he said I think he was kind of confessing that he'd done the wrong thing, and he said his best friend came into him with the newspaper in his hand, and he put it on my father's desk, and he went.
But then he got to see the movies.
Yes, the movies he was not particularly pleased with. He only started being pleased when I started writing. But like I say, my material in my stand-up act, it was a young person's act. It was generational.
It was silly.
Like the parents would go, "What do you like that stuff for?" And the kids would be going, "What are you talking about? It's fantastic." And he was an older generation, so he couldn't really appreciate it.
I mean, I find that so interesting. Just
insane.
Steve Martin takes it pretty well, but never mind a review in whatever real estate publication that was. I don't know I don't know what the circulation was of that back then, but even if I found that my dad left a negative YouTube comment, I don't think I would ever recognize him as alive again. That would be.
But writing a bad review about your appearance on SNL in a paper is funny.
It's hilarious, but also insane.
It's very insane.
It's an insane thing to do as a father.
Great story.
He mentioned the movies he wasn't a fan of either. He had a pretty harsh review of the movies as well. I thought he said in the book. Maybe I'm conflating.
Well, he just said there. He goes, he hated the movies.
He wasn't a fan. Yeah. So it's a very sad, touching ending of his book where he talks about his father. He did mention it there a little bit, where his father did change towards the end of his life, and he told Steve he loved him for the first time, and essentially that he was jealous. Steve attributes it a lot to a different generation. He didn't really understand it. But I think any dime store therapist could tell you well, this guy wanted to be an entertainer. His son was one of the most successful ever.
Yeah.
And he writes a bad review. I don't know if you need a degree to figure out what the psychology was going on.
That's
there.
exactly the thing too, is if my kid turned out to be like that, I would be very supportive and happy. I would not be like, this kid fucking sucks.
He was very resentful, and even he said that his mother was much more supportive and loved that he was famous and everything. But he said even she would say things like she knew he wrote his own material, and she would say things like, "You need new writers."
That's funny.
Just Jesus Christ, this guy. If Steve Martin's parents can't be proud of him,
Jesus,
So I just thought that was pretty wild. But to the point we talked about earlier, that's what makes a comedian. You can look at Steve Martin and say boy, he's really got it together. He's a pretty clean cut guy. Also, by the way, I should have mentioned this. One of the great geniuses of all time, much like Ted Danson, in the sense that he understood if you're going to wear a wig, go pure white. No one will ever question it. Did you know he wore a wig?
I had no idea.
There you go. Genius.
Wow.
So for those of you balding out there, consider the Steve Martin route. But yeah, I don't know, that derailed my train of thought, but he's a wise man.
Huh.
But it does, that's where comedians come from, is having some kind of trauma or weird upbringing. And he showed his stripes with his relationship with his parents.
That's a tough one. Even he's like, my mom said one nice thing, so she's the supportive parent, and she still stinks.
Yeah. Well, he was in the book. He writes about how supportive she was and everything. And it's even the way he wrote it, it kind of seemed like, I think she just liked that you were famous.
It sounded like she likes to go. She likes to go get her hair done and brag about how her kid's doing compared to everyone else's in there. That's all that is.
Speaking of family, by the way, one weird thing about Steve Martin, he is going to be 78 this year.
Jesus.
He has a 10-year-old child.
Wow.
I mean, the kid will never want for anything, obviously.
No.
You know, I think they're going to be set up for life, but that's pretty, to have a child at 67 or 68, whatever he was.
Is this like his third wife?
At least his second. I know he got divorced once. I'm not sure if it's his second or third wife.
Yeah, imagine this late. It's got to be a third.
Who knows? I don't know.
But next we have Three Amigos.
Oh, yeah. So I just threw this in to talk a little bit about his relationship with Martin Short as well. But this I did not realize. I assumed Three Amigos was a big success right out of the gate, but he talks a little bit about it here.
You guys believe the incredible success of Three Amigos now, but it really, it was a modest success.
Well, what happened was we released Three Amigos, and, I had my heart into it. I don't know what you had, but I was a writer, whatever, and it's kind of my idea. And it comes out and it does fine. And I'd go see it in a theater, and with the full audience, you wanted to see how it plays. It played okay. Yeah. And then I get a call, and it's Empire Magazine in England, which is a big movie magazine. And they said, we want to put you, Marty, and Chevy on the cover of our magazine. And I said, why? They said, well, it's the 25th anniversary of Three Amigos. And I said, so? And they explained that it was sort of this cult thing now, or hit, or right. Parents watch it with their kids, I
mean, I always had a sense of it because I would, do a lot of shows and be in a lot of airports. And you can always kind of tell when people come up to you what they're going to talk about. And if it was like, if it's, if
they're dressed like an amigo.
No. But I mean, if the guy is 28 and looks like he's been like kind of drugged for about 8 years, they're going to talk about Clifford. And but usually a 40-year-old guy would come up and he'd talk about Three Amigos.
I know Craig thinks he's a worthless hack, but I'm a Martin Short fan.
I never said that. I don't like this new marriage. Or not new, but you know what I mean.
They said that when I think they've told this story on every talk show they've been on, but I just thought it was a good line that the first time Martin Short met Steve Martin, I believe it was for Three Amigos, and he went over to his house, and Steve Martin was kind of giving him the tour, and he's looking around, and Martin Short goes, "My God, I had no idea how successful you were because I've seen your work." I just think that's a hilarious thing to say to someone the day you meet them.
That's very funny.
But so there's obviously Steve Martin had a ton of different films. Like we said, The Jerk, probably his best work. A lot of people would like Three Amigos. I always think of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. I don't know why that's my favorite Steve Martin movie.
Yeah.
Probably more for, I think it's a great John Candy performance, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Well, definitely.
But he plays I feel like those two could have been, kind of the way Farley and Spade, seemed like they were going to be.
I was going to say a better off Farley and Spade.
Yeah, I feel like they could have been a good comedy duo. But it was that the only movie they were in together?
I think so. Until, recently. Oh, John Candy. Yeah, definitely.
Recently.
In my head, as I started speaking, I was thinking of Martin Short again and how much I just don't want them to be together.
Ladies and gentlemen, John Candy. It's like, oh my God.
Yeah. Him and Carol Baskin's husband just walking out.
But like Craig alluded to, recently since, or I think even maybe before is it No Murderers in the Building? Is that the name of the show? I always fuck it up. But they, have done shit on Netflix together. And they are the new Laurel and Hardy. They're a comedy team for whatever reason. But it is kind of like there's something nice that I like about old guys like that giving each other shit. Like I could watch that all day. Even though sometimes it's schmaltzy or corny, whatever. Like I enjoy listening to just Martin Short and Steve Martin go back and forth.
Martin and Martin was just not funny. It was terrible.
I never watched it.
Oh, that's probably watch it and then we'll revisit this. But what you're thinking of is Only Murderers in the Building.
Only Murderers in the Building. I had the exact opposite.
No murder.
I was watching a completely different show, I guess. All right, what's next?
That's our last clip, and it's our famous shoehorning of Norm.
Yes, well, you thought we couldn't do it. We weren't able to do it the last couple weeks, so you thought we were down, but no. Norm's back with, this is just an interaction that he had via the internet. He's talking to Letterman here.
Get this, just earlier, this happened right before we came on the show. I walked out here. Yeah. I'm in some kind of Twitter feud with Steve Martin.
I know that Steve also actively Twitters.
Yeah. So this is what happened. Dig this. You know how to tweet?
No.
You don't know how to tweet?
No.
Where have you been? He writes a tweet. I misunderstand it. I reply.
Let's hear what he says.
What he said? Yeah. Okay. Well, this is what he said. I'm not really that great at it. He said, has anybody seen my hat? Now, I'm looked everywhere for it. I can't find my hat.
Right.
So I say, was it a brown fedora with a red hat band? But what I didn't know is he sent a twit pic.
Stop right there. Let me just say, if this is an example of Twitter communication, it's invaluable.
What do you think I should answer him? This is the last thing he said to me. He goes, this just came in 9 seconds ago. He goes, still mulling over this tweet from Norm to me. It's so enigmatic. Is it a put down?
I don't, honestly, I mean, he lost a hat, right?
Yeah.
And then you responded, is it with a red hat band?
Yeah.
None of this makes any sense.
Yeah, it's a generational thing.
Oh, that's
I
guess so. I just enjoy that clip because it's like Norm's not understanding Twitter, and then he's giving Letterman shit for not understanding it. But yeah, I would say Norm's probably another guy that definitely got some sort of influence. A completely different comedian.
Yeah,
but you can tell there's a little Steve Martin in him
for sure.
But yeah, and I'll admit, I can't say I necessarily understood all of Steve Martin's like, for example, King Tut. I don't get. Maybe you'll tell me it's some brilliant hidden genius song that I just don't understand. But like, I don't get why it was funny or anything. So there were things where it's like, I just don't get it. Like, is it that he's that much smarter than me, or is that it's just not that funny? But he truly is a genius, and I recommend. You're not going to hear me recommend a lot of books, but I would recommend the three I would recommend would be a memoir by Norm Macdonald, The Coloring Book by Colin Quinn, and Steve Martin's book Born Standing Up. I would start with all three of those if you're a comedy fan. But it's also like, it's nice to hear their voice too. It makes it much easier to. It's essentially you're just listening to a podcast about their life. But
he reads it himself.
He does, yeah.
Ooh, interesting.
So check that out, Steve Martin. Like I said, my knowledge of him was probably not that different than most people of my generation, where it's like, yeah, I knew he was a very successful stand-up, and then I just knew him as, being in a lot of these cornball movies in like the early 2000s, and being a guy who, pops on SNL once in a while. Like, that's really how I knew. I was aware of his success, but didn't really have any interest in it. And then, like I said, after reading the book and listening to a lot of the interviews that he did, I have a lot more interest and respect for him than I did previously. So check it out. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you have anything to add, as always, let us know. Message me on Patreon or Twitter, wherever you can get a hold of me. And you can find all those links at blindmike.net. That's where you can find the free links to the podcast, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and the like. You can find the Blind Mike project there. I'm echoing, so it's probably the perfect time to wrap this up.
You're not on my end, so that's good.
So check out blindmike.net, and also for Craig, go to verygoodshow.org.
Yeah,
and they have all the same stuff. You can find the links to his podcast and Patreon as well if you go to verygoodshow.org. So support the boys if you'd be so kind.
I love it. Thank you.
Anything I forgot before we get out of here?
No, not that I can think of.
All right, guys. We will talk to you next time. I will just throw this out there. I don't know the order. As always, throw suggestions for episodes. I think the next couple, I was thinking maybe Jackass.
Perfect.
One I want to do soon is Charlie Sheen, the whole Tiger Blood thing when he quit 2.5 Men.
Oh, nice.
I think that's a pretty interesting story.
Yeah.
Mort Saul, doing some of the older guys I want to do. And then we've got a good bunch of good episodes for bonus ideas as well. So get on the Patreon. Blindmike.net. We'll talk to you guys next time on Why Are You Laughing?